On air, off air, there we go.
All right. Should have cleared my throat before I started recording. Happy Hanukkah, everyone. It's good to see you all. And it's time to get down to some serious study of dreams. Because in Parashat Miketz, thank you. Dreams are rather important throughout the entire Joseph cycle, of course. Dreams have been important. Right, we had Joseph's dreams when he was a youth that got him in trouble with his family. And then we had the dreams of the baker and the butler, the cupbearer of Pharaoh at the end of last week's Torah portion. And now we're going to get the dreams of Pharaoh himself. Everyone familiar with these dreams?
Yes.
Yes, roughly?
Yes, yeah. Yes,
So,
roughly 7 cows.
7 cows, 7 ears of corn, fat cows, thin cows, good corn, bad corn.
Cows eating cows.
By the way, interesting trivia fact. Every time you see a translation in older text that says corn, I remember very distinctly myself, and then I've heard from other people as well. You immediately think of, corn on the cob, and how could they have possibly had corn in Egypt? Corn is a New World crop, which wouldn't be brought to the African, Asian, European continents for another 3,000 years or more at this point. So what in the world are they talking about? Corn is the Old English word in general for most types of grain, right? And it became, after the New World discovery, the exclusive word of that yellow thing that grows with a husk, which wasn't really yellow at the time, but that's a whole nother issue. So it became the exclusive word of that type of grain rather than the generic word for grain. So if you're ever reading through an old copy of a translation and you see the word corn being used all the time, don't be surprised. It really just means grain. There was no corn in Egypt as we know corn. So, okay. So we got the fat and the thin and the good and the bad, and Joseph does his dream interpretation. Yes? Yes. All right. So we're going to take a quick look at that, and then we're going to jump to a parallel text. We may not always realize it, but in many parts of the Tanakh, outside of the Torah, there are parallel texts. We looked at some parallel texts inside the Torah last week when we looked at the story of Judah and Tamar compared to the rest of the Joseph cycle. We're now going to go much further afield to find our parallel. But we got to get our original before we can get to the parallel. Make sense? Okay. Don't know why the throat's so scratchy this morning, or now technically afternoon. Page 250. We are starting right at the beginning, chapter 41, verse 1. And am I allowed to call on you, Harry, for reading? Okay. I don't want to be presumptuous.
That's good. After 2 years' time, Pharaoh dreamed that he was standing by the Nile, when out of the Nile there came up 7 cows, handsome and sturdy, and they grazed in the reed grass. But presently 7 other cows came up from the Nile close behind them, ugly and gaunt, and stood beside the cows on the bank of the Nile. And the ugly, gaunt cows ate up the 7 handsome, sturdy cows. And Pharaoh woke up.
Okay, not so good. Now, it's kind of hard to remember what it's like to read this for the first time because all of us know the interpretation that's coming. But you can imagine why, if you were Pharaoh, this might seem rather disturbing, right? It's apparently a nightmarish situation in his mind. He's imagining the good cows, and then these other zombie cows come up, and they just consume the good ones. And you can imagine, especially if you're an agrarian emperor, that would be kind of, what in the world's going on? Okay, cows don't generally eat cows anyway.
Right.
Onward.
He fell asleep and dreamed a second time. 7 ears of grain, solid and healthy, grew on a single stalk, but close behind them sprouted 7 ears, thin and scorched by the east wind, and the thin ears swallowed up the 7 solid and full ears. Then Pharaoh awoke. It was a dream.
All right, so second dream. And again, for us, it seems like an obvious parallel. Apparently, we're going to need someone special to interpret this, but the 7 and 7, the good and the being destroyed or overtaken by the bad, clearly disturbing to Pharaoh. So he does what anyone in the ancient world would do when they have a disturbing dream. And this is a process that was done, mentioned in the Talmud as well. You have a terrible dream, you need to get it interpreted.
So he sent for all the magicians of Egypt and all its wise men. And Pharaoh told them his dreams, but none could interpret them for Pharaoh.
All right. So you send for the wise guys, wise men, and you ask them to interpret the dream. And then you can be reassured by their interpretation or understand what is happening. Because a dream like this clearly must mean something, is the intention, is the idea. There must be some truth buried within this. And that's partly why his spirit is so agitated, because he needs to know what it is. Make sense? Okay, we're going to pause there from the Torah text.
Oh.
But I'm going to ask you for a synopsis. So what happens after this? Who remembers, or who's seen Joseph for the Technicolor Dreamcoat lately?
Yes.
Well, Joseph gets mentioned,
Oh.
and he's brought before Pharaoh to interpret the dream.
Joseph gets mentioned because he had helped the cupbearer with his dream, and he gets brought out, and he interprets the dream, as we all know, 7 years of plenty, 7 years of famine, and proposes a wonderful plan for fixing this problem, to store the extra grain, the surplus that's going to be grown during the years of plenty, so that during the years of famine, no problem.
Right, and you'd have to believe him, because the dreams that the cupbearer and the baker had when they were in prison, when Joseph interpreted them, his interpretation came true. So he has a proven track record.
He's got some track record, at least as far as the cupbearer knows. He's interpreted 2 for 2. So maybe this guy could help Pharaoh with his dream as well. Make sense?
Yeah.
And of course, Pharaoh is so taken by this wonderful interpretation and insight that he elevates Joseph up until he becomes second only to Pharaoh throughout the entire land of Egypt, and in charge of this whole process. And in being in charge of rations nowadays seem like, FEMA isn't the world's most important government agency. Being in charge of food in the ancient world was a big deal. Right, and as we're going to see, well, not today, but if you read the rest of the parasha, Joseph becomes instrumental in reshaping the entirety of Egyptian society and land ownership and all of those other good things. So it's a big deal what he ends up with. Time for our parallel text. We don't get a lot of dreams in fall. Just in time.
Just in time.
You can take one and pass it along. We don't get a lot of dreams in Tanakh. What's that? Oh, you're giving him the dream topic. Yeah, we don't get a lot of dreams in Tanakh, but those that do can be quite potent, quite powerful. And in fact, there are a couple of dreams that come much later. We're only going to look at one of them for time's sake, from the book of Daniel, that have entered into the modern idiom. Well, they've entered into the classical idiom. What's that?
Yeah,
You're
I think I know
imagining,
the
right?
reference.
So one of the things we probably know, feet of clay. You ever hear the phrase "feet of clay"?
Yes.
Right. Well, what's it mean?
Oh.
You're afraid to do something.
What's that?
Afraid to do something.
Okay, so sort of like guy called cold feet. Not exactly the way the idiom is generally used.
Take action.
Unable to move or take action.
But isn't
It's a good literal interpretation, but it's not the figurative idiom.
Right. Somebody who has a level of arrogance and hubris, but who cannot ultimately follow through because they have feet of clay.
All right, I think we're definitely getting much closer to it. So it's the idea that there's something big and mighty and impressive, but it's resting on inadequacy. It's resting on clay, which is less stable than what appears to be. So it may appear to be great and mighty and enduring, but as a matter of fact, it is just waiting for something to crack the clay, and the whole thing comes tumbling down. So when we say someone's feet has feet of clay, we mean they're not as tough, they're not as formidable as they appear to be. As a matter of fact, they could be knocked over quite easily. We're actually going to look at the dream that this comes from and what the rest of the body is made of, because it's not just the feet that gets mentioned, it's just how the idiom ended up. And you might also know, and writing on the wall. Right? I've seen the handwriting on the wall. Right? Is this talking about graffiti?
No.
No?
No.
What are we using?
know what's coming.
You know what's coming, and it's good news.
Always?
No, never. When you see the handwriting on the wall, it means that there's something bad coming, and I can see that it's coming down the pipe. But we're not going to be able to get to this one today. It's in chapter 5 of Daniel. Highly recommend you read it as well. But it has a very similar theme to the one we're looking at in terms of the prediction that's coming down. Okay, so we've got a lot of text to go through because Daniel is, shall we say, wordy. Unlike the very brief and short statements of Torah, the book of Daniel is a much more elaborate text. That's neither good nor bad, it just is. Some of the translations are also a little tricky because much of the book of Daniel is in a dialect of Aramaic rather than Hebrew. So we're going to have to deal with some of the clunkiness of the translation too. Who was Daniel, by the way? Dun, dun, dun. Yes. Okay.
He was one of the leaders of the Israelites who was in exile in Babylon.
All right. So Daniel is one of the leaders of the Israelites out in Babylon. Right. So this is after the conquest and destruction of Israel, Jerusalem, and the temple in 586 by the Babylonians, when a huge number of Jews, in particular the leaders, were taken off to Babylon as captives. And Daniel was really one of the machers of that group in exile. And he is not exactly considered to be a Navi, a prophet, because, well, for lots of reasons we can't really get into, but you'll notice that his book is outside the book of the prophets. But on the other hand, he is an exceptionally spiritual and attuned leader. And he does have visions and his own understanding of what God wants, which doesn't quite reach the level of prophetic authority that would have moved him into an earlier section of Tanakh, but does mean that he's rather important, and that's why we continue to read from him. So let's take a look at this incident from chapter 2.
In the second year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar.
And Nebuchadnezzar is the guy who conquered Israel and took and destroyed the temple and took the captives. Right? So he is the Babylonian emperor.
Nebuchadnezzar had a dream. His spirit was agitated, yet he was overcome by sleep.
Which may or may not mean that. It could mean either he was overcome by sleep or couldn't sleep. We'll see that both interpretations are possible.
The king ordered the magicians, exorcists, sorcerers, and Chaldeans to be summoned in order to tell the king what he had dreamed.
Often in English, we pronounce that with a hard Chaldean.
Chaldeans?
Yeah.
Oh.
So well, it could be either, but usually I hear it with Chaldean.
Chaldeans.
So sound familiar?
Yeah.
Right? Dream. King has a dream. King doesn't know what to do. He's agitated. King summons all the wise guys, wise men, to come and give him interpretation. So far, it sounds really, really similar to our text that we just saw in Miketz from Joseph and Pharaoh's dream. But we're going to get a difference.
They came and stood before the king, and the king said to them, I have had a dream, and I am full of anxiety to know what I have dreamed. The Chaldeans spoke to the king in Aramaic. O king, live forever. Relate the dream to your servants, and we will tell its meaning. The king said in reply to the Chaldeans, I hereby decree, if you will not make the dream and its meaning known to me, you shall be torn limb from limb, and your houses confiscated. But if you tell the dream and its meaning, you shall receive from me gifts, presents, and great honor. Therefore, tell me the dream and its meaning.
All right, so what are the consequences of getting this wrong?
You're going to be killed.
Yeah, it's not just thank you very much for your attempt. You may go. It's you got it wrong, you're dead. And that's a little different than what we saw with Pharaoh.
And even if they get it wrong, even if they're too scared to do it at this point, say we're not going to say anything, he'll kill them also.
Yeah, you don't get to just say I can't.
Right.
And that's kind of a problem.
Yeah.
And there's a little bit of a difference as well. And in fact, it may have slipped past, but he's going to emphasize it in his second response here.
Okay.
So
once again, they answered, let the king relate the dream to his servants, and we will tell you its meaning. But the king said in reply, it is clear to me that you are playing for time. since you see that I have decreed that if you do not make the dream known to me, there is but one verdict for you. You have conspired to tell me something false and fraudulent until circumstances change. So relate the dream to me, and I will then know that you can tell its meaning.
All right, so what's he getting upset about? And what's he asking of them?
He wants them to to tell him what his dream had been, even though he
Yes,
hasn't said.
exactly right. He's not telling them the dream.
No.
He's telling them, I had a dream. You tell me what it was, and you tell me what it means.
You're so smart.
Well, it's partly a question of you're so smart you can do it, but it's also a question of he may not know his dream anymore.
Oh.
Right? That I don't know whether you've had this experience.
Yes. Yes.
You wake up in the morning and you feel agitated and angst, and you know you just had a horrible dream, and you can't for the life of you remember what was happening in it. All you remember is the emotion that you woke with. And he's looking for some of these magician type people to do their magic and open up his mind so that the dream will be remembered, and he will then be able to uncover its meaning. Right? So it may not just be that this is a test. It may be that he legitimately can't remember. Remember the idea that he was overcome by sleep or couldn't sleep. It could be very well that he had this dream, but that he couldn't like wake up and write it down or do something else. He still went back to sleep and it was all muddled. It's all a haze, and he's demanding that they clear it up for him. Yeah, wow, tall order, right? Not a good day to be a Chaldean.
No. So the Chaldeans said in reply to the king, there is no one on earth who can satisfy the king's demand. For great king, our ruler, none has ever asked such a thing of any magician, exorcist, or Chaldean. The thing asked by the king is difficult. There is no one who can tell it to the king except the gods whose abode is not among mortals. Whereupon the king flew into a violent rage and gave an order to do away with all the wise men of Babylon.
All right. Yeah, so first of all, we're getting a sense of who this guy is, right? Nebuchadnezzar. If you thought Pharaoh was bad, this guy's even worse. And that's one of our first parallel marks, is that what Joseph faced with Pharaoh was one degree of difficulty and a difficult monarch, and what Daniel is going to be facing with Nebuchadnezzar is a degree even worse. Now, one of the reasons why this parallel might be here is because of the context, right? Think about what was happening to Joseph in Egypt. Right? Joseph was in exile. Joseph had been taken as a slave. Joseph was far from home, taken from the land of Israel. And Joseph was at the whim of the local powers and authorities. And what happens? He rises, right? He rises to the top. And that model is going to become a very important theme for Jews and exiles that come much later. And so this story of Daniel rising in a similar way to Joseph, but against even worse odds, is going to be inspirational to the rest of us who had to go through a few thousand years of exile and had to deal with monarchs that were every bit as capricious as Nebuchadnezzar. Just many of them had easier names, and had to deal, and yet somehow we continued in most countries in most times to rise. And that parallel is being played out here in the court of Nebuchadnezzar in the days of Daniel. Make sense? Okay, onward.
The decree condemning the wise men to death was issued. Daniel and his companions were about to be put to death. So Daniel went to the king to ask for time that he might tell the meaning to the king. Then Daniel went to his house and informed his companions, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, of the matter, that they might implore the God of heaven for help regarding this mystery, so that Daniel and his colleagues would not be put to death together with the wise men of Babylon. The mystery was revealed to Daniel in a night vision. Then Daniel blessed the God of heaven. Daniel spoke up and said, let the name of God be blessed forever and ever, for wisdom and power are his. He changes times and seasons, removes kings and installs kings. He gives the wise their wisdom and knowledge to those who know. He reveals deep and hidden things, knows what is in the darkness, and light dwells with him. I acknowledge and praise you, God of my fathers, you who have given me wisdom and power. For now you have let me know what we asked of you. You have let us know what concerns the king.
All right, now if some of those phrases sound familiar, that shouldn't be too surprising. Much language from the later sections of Tanakh found its way into our traditional liturgy. So that is why this has a lot of echoes. But Daniel's speech is really just a very long way of what Joseph said when was asked about Pharaoh, whether he could interpret the dream. And he says, well, not I. God will see to Pharaoh's dream. Right? God will take care of it. And that's what Daniel is saying here as well. He is making sure that he's not in his own heart taking credit for what God has gifted him as the ability to get out of this horrible situation. It's not him, it's God. And he's going to make that even clearer to the king when he gets a chance to talk to him.
So Arioch rushed Daniel into the king's presence and said to him, I have found among the exiles of Judah a man who can make the meaning known to the king. The king said in reply to Daniel, can you really make known to me the dream that I saw and its meaning? Daniel answered the king and said, the mystery about which the king has inquired, wise men, exorcists, magicians, and diviners cannot tell to the king. But there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries, and he has made known to King Nebuchadnezzar what is to be at the end of days.
All right, so now we begin to know that the topic of the king's dream is the end of days. Right, that this wasn't just any old dream. This was a biggie, and it's not Daniel that's figuring it out. And no one should be surprised that the magicians couldn't figure it out. This is something that's only coming because God has chosen to make this information be revealed at this time and in this way.
Is this at the time when King Nebuchadnezzar would also think he was a god like the kings of Egypt?
Oh, absolutely. I mean,
so he thinks he's God.
He is, he is power on earth. He is everything. He is the top of the current mightiest empire that the region has ever seen.
Okay. This is your dream and the vision that entered your mind in bed, King. The thoughts that came to your mind in your bed, are about future events. He who reveals mysteries has let you know what is about to happen. Not because my wisdom is greater than that of other creatures has this mystery been revealed to me, but in order that the meaning should be made known to the king, and that you may know the thoughts of your mind. King, as you looked on, there appeared a great statue. This statue, which was huge and its brightness surpassing, stood before you, and its appearance was awesome.
And that's awesome before it got used by the surfers, right? Right. It's awesome. It's something that creates awe in you.
The head of that statue.
Maybe awe-inspiring would be better for modern English.
The head of that statue was of fine gold. Its breast and arms were of silver, its belly and thighs of bronze, its legs were of iron, and its feet part iron and part clay. As you looked on, a stone was hewn out, not by hands, and struck the statue on its feet of iron and clay and crushed them. All at once, the iron, clay, bronze, silver, and gold were crushed and became like chaff of the threshing floors of summer. A wind carried them off until no trace of them was left. But the stone that struck the statue became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. Such was the dream, and we will now tell the king its meaning.
All right, don't read ahead, flip it back. What does it mean?
Twice.
Well, first of all, do we understand the image? All right, there is a mighty statue, and the head is made of gold. And then the sort of arms and chest level are silver, and then bronze around about this area, and then iron down here, and then a mix of iron and clay for the feet. Feet of clay, right? Hence where the idiom comes from. And a rock appears sort of out of nowhere, and it just is hurled down and smashes the clay of the feet. And of course, once the feet go, everything goes too, right? It doesn't matter how beautiful the gold head is. If the feet break, the whole thing is down, and more than just down, it is turned into dust, like the chaff on a summer's day. I don't know if you've ever seen pictures of people sorting through wheat on a hilltop. You throw the wheat up, the wind blows the chaff away, and the good kernels fall back down. That's what you eat. That's how you sort wheat before you get proper sorters in modern mechanical style. And you can just imagine it's just carried off in the wind, right? This whole statue, this mighty, awe-inspiring thing has now just been erased from existence by this rock, and this rock grows and grows and grows until it covers the earth. All very clear, right?
Yeah.
But you can understand maybe why Nebuchadnezzar, if he had this dream, would wake up feeling a little agitated, even if he couldn't remember it. This might be traumatizing. Maybe?
Yeah.
Maybe. Well, let's see what you think after Daniel gives his interpretation.
You, king, to whom the King of Kings, the God of heaven, has given kingdom, power, might, and glory, into whose hands he has given men, wild beasts, and the fowl of heaven, wherever they may dwell, and to whom he has given dominion over them all, you are the head of gold.
Well, that sounds pretty good, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right? I'm a gold head. It's better than being the bottom, right?
But another kingdom will arise after you, inferior to yours. Then yet a third kingdom of bronze, which will rule over the whole earth. But the fourth kingdom will be as strong as iron, just as iron crushes and shatters everything, and like iron that smashes, so will it crush and smash all these. You saw the feet and the toes, part potter's clay and part iron. That means it will be a divided kingdom. It will have only some of the stability of iron, inasmuch as you saw iron mixed with the common clay, and the toes were part iron and part clay, that the kingdom will be in part strong and in part brittle. You saw iron mixed with common clay. That means they shall intermingle with the offspring of men, but shall not hold together, just as iron does not mix with clay. And in the time of those kings, the God of heaven will establish a kingdom that shall never be destroyed, a kingdom that shall not be transferred to another people. It will crush and wipe out all these kingdoms, but shall itself last forever. Just as you saw how a stone was hewn from the mountain, not by hands, and crushed the iron, bronze, clay, silver, and gold. The great God has made known to the king what will happen in the future. The dream is sure and its interpretation reliable.
You can bank on it.
Yes.
All right, so what's the interpretation? Anyone want to give me a historical shorthand?
Well, what came to mind is that the second to last kingdom is Rome.
Mm-hmm.
And when it gets, I would assume that Christianity loves this in the sense that then Rome is replaced by Christianity, which then becomes forever.
Christians do indeed have a fondness for the book of Daniel.
Yes.
Partly that's because the book of Daniel is open to such interpretations.
Right.
I mean, many interpretations. And so something that is pregnant with metaphor can be made to give birth to anything.
I think they meant Israel.
What's that? Okay, well,
Wait,
yes.
right.
That's what I
Daniel,
thought.
on the other hand,
Oh,
would clearly be thinking of Israel
okay.
as being the stone
Right.
that comes. So there's a question here. So first of all, we have either an immediate question of more recent prophecy, that is to say recent to Daniel's days, or whether we're looking at long-term prophecy. So either Daniel is prophesying for the end of ends, meaning the end of days, the coming of the Messiah, the rock that will last forever, or he's talking about something that was more immediate in his future and was really meant kingdoms that would immediately follow from Nebuchadnezzar.
But wouldn't that be scary to Nebuchadnezzar to hear that he was about to be overthrown?
Well,
I
yes.
wouldn't think he'd be pleased with this interpretation, and there doesn't seem to be a solution the way Joseph offered Pharaoh a solution for the cows. This doesn't seem to be coming to anything that
No.
I don't want to know.
On the other
Nebuchadnezzar
hand,
does.
he gets to be gold,
Right.
Well, there you go.
right? So yes, you're right. The long-term forecast is everything that has been built from you and then by those that that come after you is going to eventually be crushed and crumbled by the rock of Israel. the Rock of Ages, you might say.
Mhm.
But right now you're gold.
Mhm.
And if you are selfish and very much focused on the short term, like Nebuchadnezzar probably was, that may be good enough.
Mhm.
And so indeed, he may not be as upset or be looking for a solution to this long-term, hundreds of years down the road forecast. If we think of this as being more immediate rather than eternal, rather than looking at the long-term end of days, we can actually begin to suspect and map out who these kingdoms would have been. You would have had Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian Empire itself, which would have been supplanted by the Persian Empire, which would have been supplanted by the Alexander the Great's empire that came and stormed through. And we're all going back to our world history classes, which would have then been succeeded by the division of his kingdom, the Ptolemies and the Seleucids for the main part that this would have been concerned with. There was another third kingdom in the Macedonian wing. And then the Ptolemies and Seleucids would have continued to fight and just wrestle over, in particular, the land of Israel, until eventually the Seleucids took over, and then they became weak and brittle, and in fact, even got beaten up by someone. Who beat up the Seleucid Empire that we might care about?
The Maccabees.
The Maccabees. Right? So there are many scholars that say this is a prophecy of the Maccabee revolt. Right? That the feet of clay were smashed by the Maccabees, by the hammers. That we were telling Nebuchadnezzar, you're right now you're golden, and the people who come after you are still going to be powerful, and the people who come after them are going to be powerful, and the people who come after them are going to be powerful. But eventually we're going to get to the clay, and when we do, smack, and we will be independent again. And indeed, as I think it's important to keep reminding ourselves, it wasn't until the Maccabee Revolution and their eventual success that we had an independent Jewish kingdom once again. Right? The Persians allowed us to return to our homeland, and we were very grateful for that. And they allowed us to rebuild the Temple of Jerusalem, and we were grateful for that. But we were not independent. We were part of their empire. Right? We were a tributary of their empire. We were a principality of their empire. And when Alexander came and defeated them, he left us as a principality of his new empire. And when the Ptolemies and the Seleucids took over after him, we were a tributary of, alternatively, the two different kingdoms, depending upon who was winning at any given time. And when the Seleucids took over, sort of finally, we were a province of theirs. It wasn't until the success of the Maccabees that we were actually independent, completely again. And that was a major transformation. And it was something that was rather unexpected. I mean, who would imagine this little guy sitting here, Daniel, staring at the golden head of this mightiest monarch that the world had seen till that time, saying, you know what, eventually we're going to break this. Because eventually this is going to wear itself out and it's going to become weak and brittle, no matter how magnificent it looks right now. And we will endure. You won't. You will be turned to dust. You will be lost on the winds of history. But we will become a stone that never is destroyed, that never is removed from the earth. And the king's dream was right, at least with that interpretation.
Rabbi, has there been any midrash on the fact that the statue, you can make the argument, sort of ultimately rots from the head down, whereas the rock starts from ground level and goes up? Exactly.
And the rock is, indeed, and we're going to see a commentary that sort of plays off that idea as well, that the rock is just a rock, right? It's not gold or silver or bronze. It's just a rock. And it starts small and hewn, and yet it grows to cover the earth, as opposed to the mighty, shiny, goldy, which only diminishes as time goes on. So yes, absolutely. We're going to see a midrash that plays almost exactly that theme. Other questions or comments before we see Nebuchadnezzar's reaction?
Then King Nebuchadnezzar prostrated himself and paid homage to Daniel and ordered that a meal offering and pleasing offerings be made to him. The king said in reply to Daniel, "Truly, your God must be the God of gods and the Lord of kings and the revealer of mysteries, to have enabled you to reveal this mystery."
Just in case you think this is all good and now Daniel's going to have a happy life, don't worry, he still has to go through the lion's den.
Oh.
He has to still watch as his friends are thrown into a fiery furnace. It's not all happy days in the days of Daniel, even though he is acknowledged and God is acknowledged as being pretty spiffy. Nebuchadnezzar doesn't exactly get the message perfectly. So yes, it's he stays golden, but the prophecy continues its march through history. So it's good sometimes to know a little bit of history because it makes some of these texts a lot more understandable, rather than just things that create a lovely idiom. All right, so now we know feet of clay. Now, how has our tradition analyzed this this section, and what can we do with it? All right, so Da'atzukenim.
Rashi draws our attention to the fact that when the reaction of King Nebuchadnezzar to his dream is described in the book of Daniel, the author uses a different conjugation,
V'titpa'em, it's the hitpa'el type conjugation.
which is a combination of the passive and reflexive mode. His interpreters were required to tell him what he had dreamt as well as what it meant. Pharaoh, on the other hand, had only forgotten the interpretation of what he had seen in the dream,
Which is used in a different conjugational form. So the two verbs are different in each place, even though you don't really see it in, even though you don't see it here. When it says that they were anxious or upset, it's doubled in a sense, a grammatical sense, when it's talking about Nebuchadnezzar than when it's talking about Pharaoh. And so the commentator is saying, why would it be doubled? Because he didn't just forget the meaning, he also forgot the dream. Make sense?
Right.
Okay, onward.
One of the differences between the two dreams was that Nebuchadnezzar dreamed something that would occur in the distant future, whereas Pharaoh dreamt something that would occur almost immediately. If Daniel had not been able to tell Nebuchadnezzar what he had dreamt, he would never have believed the interpretation that Daniel offered him.
Right?
Right.
And some guy, and you get hints of that in his early confrontation with the Chaldeans, where he's saying, you're just playing for time, right? You're just going to come up with any old interpretation. I'm going to say, you know, I dreamt of squirrels. And you're going to say, the squirrels represent that in 100 years' time, there will be a mighty nut orchard in the middle of Babylon. And 100 years from now, who's going to be there to find out, right? It can make up any old rubbish if you make it long distance. Or if you just try to play for time. But
seeing that Joseph interpreted Pharaoh's dreams as predicting matters that would occur in the immediate future, he believed him. As otherwise, he could have called him a liar within a short time and have dealt with him as a false prophet.
Right. So, okay, you think there's going to be 7 years of plenty. Good. Stay right here for a couple of years.
Right.
And in a couple of years, if we haven't had some years of plenty, then you're going to be dead. So Joseph didn't have as high a bar to pass in terms of getting the king's confidence as Daniel did, because Joseph was staking what his interpretation was on immediate events. Whereas Daniel, because he was interpreting it based on a long-term forecast that no one who he was talking to would ever be alive to confirm, he had to give additional evidence that what he was saying was true, and providing the dream itself without having been told, that's pretty serious proof that you know what you're talking about. Make sense? Okay, so again, we got these parallels going between Daniel and Joseph.
As to Nebuchadnezzar having meted out the death penalty to all the interpreters who had failed to interpret his dream, this was partly due to their having said that no human being could interpret his dream, only angels. The word
Ve'ochoran lo itai, which is the Aramaic, which would mean like nobody around can do that, would be the general translation. But you could read it.
Should be read as there is no Aaron nowadays who by means of the Urim and Tumim in the folds of his breastplate could have secured an answer from God to his query.
All right, so they're making a play on that word, the first word there in the Hebrew, ve'achoran, and they're saying ve'aharon, right? There's no Aaron, as opposed to there's no one. And so the commentators making a little bit of a wordplay, a pun, if you will, to say that they were saying there's no Aaron. Why was there no Aaron who could use the Urim and Tumim?
He destroyed the.
Because they destroyed the temple. And according to the Midrash, it was the Chaldeans and the other magicians who told Nebuchadnezzar to destroy the temple. Right, so they had said these are people who are dangerous and a god that is a threat. Destroy their temple, wipe them out, and all of this. And having done so, he's now confronted with the problem that he has a dream that can't be answered by anybody on earth unless they have access to heaven. But the people who had access to heaven, he wiped out. And so that's why he is, according to this interpretation, even angrier with his wise men, because they were the cause of him now being stuck with no one to interpret this type of dream. Right? It's like, you got me stuck here, people. So what good are you to me? Right? You can't help me, and you killed, or had me kill, the only people who could help, so I might as well kill you. Make sense?
Yeah.
Maybe? All right.
Yeah.
From his point of view, it makes perfect sense. If you're one of the wise men, or if you're one of the Judeans, it is not so sensible. But then, how often do emperors have to be sensible? As Mel Brooks famously said, it's good to be the king.
Nebuchadnezzar, when hearing these words of Daniel, told him that he now remembered about the significance of that breastplate and the Urim and the Tumim. He added that the Jewish people had lost their world because their priests had made unlawful use of that breastplate. That is why he decreed a similar fate for his own priests.
That this idea of interpretation through the Urim and Tumim, through this gift of prophetic insight that was there with the breastpiece, with the stones that were kept in the back fold, wasn't meant to just be used willy-nilly. And this is kind of also bringing it back, as often happens in our texts, to say it wasn't just the wise men that got us in trouble. We got ourselves in trouble because we were misusing this gift that God had given us. Maybe? Okay. That's okay. You don't need to worry about that last part so much. It's not a major point. All right. And Sforno, from a later line in the book of Genesis, is going to draw us all the way to where we were in Daniel. So let's see how beautifully he stitches these parts together.
God will continue to act as the shepherd of Israel, preserving his people who will endure like a stone. It does not matter whether this stone is intrinsically precious or not. Being a stone, it will endure. The enduring nature of a stone is best illustrated in Daniel 2:34.
Right. So we saw this idea of the stone that is like a mountain which endures, unlike the gold, the silver, the bronze, the clay, the iron, which does not endure. Right. And as Paul, you had said, what about the value? Is it something to do with that? And here's Forno's agreeing with you that it's not the value that makes the stone last. Right. It's not how precious it is. It's not how rich it is, or as the wealth and preciousness of the other metals in the statue symbolize. It's not about the power, the material power, the military power, the economic might, the rulership of territories and giant empires. That isn't what makes the stone endure. The stone endures because it's a stone. And what is its stoniness that makes that endurance? That's where we carry on.
The reason Israel would survive is because they keep their faith with God and man. The Sanhedrin explains that the reason why Jews, even when defeated, exiled, etc., rose to high positions in their host country was because the rulers valued their loyalty.
We keep faith. And he means that both we keep faith, meaning we keep our allegiance to God, and we keep faith, meaning we are honest and trustworthy to other human beings. Our word is our word, right? Our contract is our contract, and we are loyal. And Sforno brings it full circle back to Joseph, and then through Daniel, and then on into every exile since, to say that we continue to endure because it's in our nature to endure because of how we keep faith. And just as Joseph kept faith with Pharaoh, when he could have exploited his position, as he had kept faith, by the way, with Potiphar, when he could have gone with Mrs. Potiphar. So too Daniel keeps faith with Nebuchadnezzar, despite the guy being such a wretch. And so too we are loyal. It doesn't mean that we're suckers. It doesn't mean that we roll over for anyone, but it does mean that when we say we will do something, or when we are in a foreign country, we give our full allegiance to the country. If you look back at the roles in the armies of World War I, you will see that there were Jews who were on both sides. There were Jews in the German trenches, and there were Jews in the French and British trenches.
That was why some of them found it so difficult to absorb what was happening when the Nazis.
Absolutely,
Right.
because Jews had been loyal citizens
And
and highly decorated of Germany. And why a generation earlier with the Dreyfus affair, Jews had been loyal citizens of the French Republic, and also couldn't understand why they were being singled out for this harassment and anti-Semitism. And Sforno was saying that is one of the characteristics that has allowed us to endure, because we are loyal and keep faith. And yes, there are unfortunately far too many incidents where we are abused despite that trait. But what he is arguing is that we wouldn't have endured without it. That yes, sometimes some rulers will be bad, even though we've been loyal. But by and large, we have been able to get by and to endure despite the hardships of the exile, because even the most callous observer has noticed that we are generally loyal and good people. They may not always like us, but they can't fault us for that. And that has been part of our enduring quality under the pressures of the exile, which again, Daniel is beginning to presage the recurring theme and the recurring wisdom literature of how do you remain Jewish when you live within a foreign country? How do you endure when everything you thought that was necessary for endurance has been taken away from you? Your land, your country, the temple, the structures and forms of your religion, the kings that you had, the armies that you used to have, all of that has been stripped away. How will you continue? How will you endure? And the answer is we'll continue by faith and by being loyal to both God and each other. And when we talk about the might of the Maccabees and their victory, ultimately that is the theme that has to come through in Hanukkah. Not the military might, not their prowess in battle and all of that, but what endured from the Maccabees was the idea that we would be willing to fight to remain Jewish. We didn't fight the Persians even when they gave us back our land to be independent. We didn't fight Alexander the Great. We didn't fight the Ptolemies. We didn't fight the Seleucids to have an independent Judean kingdom. We only fought when they wanted to take away our faith. And then we said, no, we'll send you our taxes. We'll let you run the army in the area. We'll put up with your regulations or whatever, but you can't take away our faith. For that, we'll fight, because we are loyal to God, just as we have been loyal to you. And if we have to choose between you and God, then we'll pick God. But we'd rather be able to have both. And ultimately, we won. And we found out that the Seleucid Empire really had feet of clay. And we were able to be independent for 100 years before, unfortunately, we ended up with some very bad kings of our own who invited the Romans in to help settle a secession dispute. And the rest, as they say, is history. All right, so this evening we are having a wonderful Hanukkah celebration, so please make sure you come back. If you haven't RSVP'd already, just let the office know you're coming. Everything is free. We already have 100 and something people coming, so come and join the fun, because we endure.
You do? Oh, thank you. Take it.
There we go.